How is it going, everybody? My name is DeMarco, and today we're talking Avowed. I know the Starfield content is popping off, but I hope some others will join me for other games that I'm excited for, and Avowed is absolutely one of them. It's a title that I was immediately enamored and excited by the moment that it was shown off years ago for the first time. I loved what Obsidian did with the Outer Worlds, and even though myself and several others did have criticisms about that game, honestly, it gets me more excited for their follow-up title. They could really take back some of those criticisms, take some of the feedback, and use it to improve their next entry. In this case, it's Avowed. And all of that is wrapped up nicely in this fantasy genre, which is really my personal bread and butter. And seeing as how we're not getting another Witcher game and we're not getting another Elder Scrolls for quite some time, Avowed is what I'm going to be sinking my teeth into. Or rather, what I hope I'll be excited to sink my teeth into. Recently, we did get a nice chunk of gameplay at the Xbox Showcase, and fans have walked away, some fans have walked away a little bit concerned based on some of the elements that were shown off, which I'm sure many of you have seen those already. Some I think is fair, others I think we just need to take a step back and wait a bit for more details. So today I wanted to offer my overall opinions on Avowed, what was shown off, some of the criticisms that were given, and some new details and some new information that was provided from a developer interview that I wanted to share with all of you today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, one of the things that people have been quick to jump on was the change in overall tone. If you take a look at the Avowed subreddit, you'll see plenty of these posts. There's more to the conversation than just this, but it's noticeably one of the bigger talking points. And it's very noticeable. It's one of the most distinguished differences between the CGI trailer that we originally got, put in this much more gray and dark universe. It painted this vision of a dark fantasy setting. However, what we ended up seeing was a lot more vibrant, a lot brighter, more saturated color palette with more alien type worlds similar to the Outer Worlds. And a lot of folks took that and said, that's not really what I was expecting. And I do understand that this kind of elevates some folks' frustration about the presentation of CGI trailers. I personally usually don't mind them if they appropriately set the tone of the game. I think it's exciting to start speculating about the future projects that these studios are now taking upwards of 6 years to make. But there is a stark contrast when you look at the reception to a game like Avowed versus Fable, which Fable released information pretty much at the same times. You have their CGI trailer, their gameplay reveal, but what they showed off at the Xbox Showcase was a lot more in line with the CGI trailer, and so you don't see this type of criticism in that area. Now, I do want to start off by saying I don't think Obsidian at any point was trying to intentionally mislead their audience. There's realistically one of two things, possibly both, that I see going on. One is they just had a change in direction somewhere in the middle of development, which now that games are taking 6+ years to develop, as it was said by Matt Booty and some others at Xbox, that's to be expected as you see the vision, all the different parts come together to make a cohesive experience. Those types of things do happen. The other part of it is potentially that we just didn't see the darker side of this universe that just wasn't portrayed here. And whether or not that was a good decision, if it is the case, that's to the individual. But it's possible we might see more of that side of things, what we got in the CGI, just when we get more gameplay later on. My personal thoughts is that I can actually appreciate and respect this different direction that the game is going with, the more alien and saturated palette versus the dark fantasy games which we've seen quite a bit of lately. You look at the main staple fantasy games of recent memory, those will be things like Elden Ring and the Souls series that really did stand out, the Witcher series, which is marred by moral dilemmas and morally gray areas, or something even if you want to go further back like Skyrim, obviously a staple as far as the fantasy genre goes. And even that game is defined largely by its gray palettes, its cold, snowy mountains in the northern reaches of Tamriel. Skyrim is definitely the weakest example of the bunch, but it does tie into the next part. But even within the context of those games, you still have the juxtaposition of different biomes. You look at Skyrim with the Rift and all the fall foliage, completely contrary to a lot of the other landscapes in the game, or even with The Witcher, you have the rich areas of the city of Novigrad that are bright and vibrant versus the lands and fields and the war-torn Velen that are there, or even the lower districts of Novigrad if you want to keep it within the same city. So it's very possible that we've just seen one element of this game, the rest remains to be shown off. And with an Obsidian game, we know for a fact that we're just seeing the beginning of it. This is not at all encompassing of everything we can expect in the game to any capacity. So those elements might be there, just not what we've seen so far. Also, for the small percentage of people that were trying to compare the graphics of the CGI trailer to the graphics of the gameplay, that was never going to be the same. That one's on you. But at the very least, and from a visual standpoint, I know a lot of people might have been looking forward to that other tone that was shown to us, but I will say, I don't mind that Avowed is using this color palette in order to, at least visually, make itself distinct from a lot of these other titles. Also, something worth keeping in mind, even if it's not present in the visual style of the game, you still have the darker undertones that the story, at least, seemingly is putting forward. You have Kai, who's narrating this trailer.
You're either here to save us or destroy us.
And that in and of itself sets a pretty dark premise for the things we might be able to do in the game. Then you see this parasitic fungal disease that's spreading around the lands of Aora, and we're sent to investigate that, so there's a little bit of a darker undertone there, and I'm sure it persists to other areas as well. Sorry that I've rambled on about the visual style and the tone of the game. It's just what I see being talked about the most now, so I wanted to make sure I gave a pretty comprehensive look into it, at least my perspective into it. But arguably, what's the most important part of the game, that's going to be the gameplay. This is what's really going to let this title sink or swim, and there are some positive things that I'm seeing based on interviews with the development team. So PC Gamer did an excellent article. I want to go through a couple of their points, and this is where we really start to see a lot of the transition in development and change in direction start to shine, where CEO Fergus Urquhart openly stated that originally the vision was to be more akin to Skyrim, but the development since changed to do what Obsidian does best, and they said that is their version of RPG. So as far as what we can expect from Avowed, it will absolutely be taking on that smaller world space similar to the Outer Worlds, with hub-like areas that are complete with NPCs and quests to complete and areas to explore, and then you move between them to continue your exploration. He mentions how companions are an integral part of this, stating we could go off and create an 8km by 8km open world and then deal with all the consequences of that, because that makes it a different style game. But we want to tell more confined stories that the player can experience with their companions and then move from part of the world to part of the world. And like I said, in the end, that's us. So really trying to stay true to that Obsidian identity. And again, not only do I think it works well for them, but it does help them stand out in a crowded RPG space to make their games feel uniquely identifiable to them, and they can play to those strengths. And in this case, one of those are developing their companions, where it's been mentioned how companions this time around are not meant to feel as just background characters, but they're meant to be integral to the story. Carrie Patel of Obsidian said one thing we wanted to do with Avowed was make sure the companions felt really integral to the story. In some games, they're optionally recruitable, but in Avowed, they're deeply tied to the story, tied to your party. We really wanted to create this sense that you're going to this big wild frontier, you're going on this adventure of discovery, and you have this small but tight-knit crew with you. The sense of adventuring through the wilds together, sharing the discovery and the danger, these people are just as much a part of your story as the larger events that you're getting in the middle of. And ultimately, all of this just needs to be tied up. Again, it comes back to good gameplay and a good story in the background, and if that comes in the form of having well-developed side characters and followers and companions, that to me sounds great. It goes back to some of the elements that were great about the original Knights of the Old Republic games, and it also brings me vibes of Mass Effect, where companions are incredibly crucial and part of that story as well. So that sounds good to me. This idea of really built out and fleshed out companions, in addition to making these smaller hub-like areas versus the true open world, bleeds into their philosophy and their approach to the combat as well, where Patel went on to say that they focused more on depth rather than breadth, and the first-person combat ended up benefiting too. They said it was an example of a piece of Avowed that was surprisingly fun in their first vertical slice, a time when the team has to decide on what to commit more resources to and what to scale back on. Combat became a key focus, which should be music to the ears of every Elder Scrolls player who's found the sword swinging a bit wimpy. Our combat has come along really well, and the bones have been there since the beginning. Patel cited a lot of time spent tuning the field, swinging a sword versus a mace versus an axe to make the combat feel right. But the options available to players seem like the more significant element at play here. You're free to dual wield weapons, wield both magic and melee simultaneously, and as in Pillars of Eternity, there are some old-timey guns available. One of the things that I've seen a bit of is people commenting on their take about the combat, whether it was the animations or the style, just the presentation of it feeling a little bit off. Some people liked it, some people didn't. Maybe I'm just easy to please. I thought it looked really well, especially when it bled into some of the magic elements that I do want to talk about. Ultimately, I have confidence in Obsidian. If they say that they had this right from the get-go and it felt right the first time they tried out the vertical slice and they've only been improving it since then, I do think that we're going to get something that feels substantially better than what we got in the Outer Worlds. And that's really where my head is at. The worst case scenario, it feels about the same as the Outer Worlds does, and that's not really all that much of a bad thing. I will say there's a lot of times where I've judged a combat system based on what I've seen, and it's completely different when you actually get your hands on the game and play it for yourself, and that doesn't include any amount of fine-tuning that can be done to improve the presentation of that system and fine-tune the way that it's shown off before the release of the game sometime in 2024, possibly a whole year from now. What excited me personally was the magic. In these fantasy games, you always get your traditional lightning spells, frost spells, fire spells. Something like frost might slow enemies a little bit. That's par for the course. But with Avowed, there were more creative spell effects, and it didn't just apply to magical abilities. You also had the melee type skills, such as the shield charge, the bash, the kicking your enemies and foes. Those types of things that make combat feel a lot more dynamic, interactive, and fun. Spells that allow you to not just shoot a fireball, but entirely entangle your enemies with vines from the ground, or manipulate gravity to suck them into the air to pull off some combos. In that way, it actually reminded me a bit more of Divinity Original Sin, having those first-person abilities and those types of magic spells, which is a lot of fun when you really get to play with them. Combine that too with firearms that help it to stand out a little bit more from traditional fantasy games, and it's piling up to be something pretty exciting. A couple of other details coming from this GameSpot interview. They do mention that you have an established role as an Imperial envoy, but your personality, appearance, and philosophy and vibe you bring to that role is up to you as a player to decide. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that you have some rooted initiative to bring you into the world, a reason for being there. Kind of just kicks off the story, and considering this is a more story focused game, that makes sense. You can play as a human or an elf, but not other races, which I know is going to come to the disappointment of certain players, and I understand why. You have this Pillars of Eternity universe. We've already seen a lot of the creative other races that exist here, but you can only play as solely the two. I guess the ultimate goal is, again, they're really not going for pure width, they're going for this more tightly knitted experience. So if your race plays much heavier into the way the story develops and the choices that you can make, that to me is a good or a fair trade-off. Purely single player, not co-op, is a good thing to me. The world is slightly systemic, think water and lightning interactions, but not the old bucket on the head trick. Again, with the Outer Worlds, you didn't have the same interactivity where you could pick up every object the way you could in a Bethesda game, but if by this they mean I could shoot lightning at water and it's going to electrocute the surface of the water, that's awesome. I like, again, reminding me of Divinity a little bit, that you can have the different surfaces and your spells will interact with those surfaces accordingly. Creates more dynamic gameplay, more engaging combat scenarios, and just generally speaking makes the world feel a bit more interesting. You'll have two companions with you at a time with their own combat specialties and of course personalities, and we know that they're playing a larger role in the overall game. There are several ability trees to progress through, and you won't be locked to a particular class or play style. And finally, you will level up, but the focus is on unlocking abilities rather than putting points into stats to grow stronger. I'm really curious, at what point in game development did we decide that putting points into different skills was a bad level up system? As a D&D player, I personally like it, but it is what it is. I think it does work to really help you customize the type of class that you want to be, to really fit any character mold that you're trying to be, as the lack of restriction of having a particular class so that you can try out a spell here, a gun there, a sword over this time, and just generally change out your playstyle as you progress and your character grows, is a good system. Now, it's important to note that my perspective into all of this is coming from an outsider who's never played the Pillars of Eternity franchise before, an outsider who's excited to jump into this world for the very first time. Doesn't mean I won't go back and play those other games. I probably will at some point. I'm getting more used to and enjoying isometric RPGs a lot more than I used to. And it actually does remind me quite a bit, this situation in particular, of when Bethesda took over the Fallout franchise and they turned it from that isometric style to a full 3D open world. And a lot of people said they're going to kill the franchise, that it's not going to work, and yet they managed to pull off one of the greatest RPGs to date. And the obvious hope is that something similar can happen with Pillars of Eternity universe. I think fans of the Outer Worlds are really going to like what they get here, and especially when Obsidian is making comments about how they've refined their vision in order to accomplish what they know that they do well, playing to their strengths. That is easily the more optimistic, the more uplifting thing that I hear about all of this project, and that's what gets me excited, because Obsidian does do several RPG elements, the choice, the world reactions, and all those other things, the companions. They do that really well. That's their bread and butter for these RPGs, and if they're expanding on that part of the game, which I've said they are, then I'm looking forward to the experience, ultimately speaking. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Thank you all so much for watching this Avowed video. If you want more, do continue to stay tuned to this channel, and as always, I hope to see you all next time. So long, everybody.